The summer sun was burning hot that day in Montana, and dust was flying everywhere as horses ran wild in the big wooden corral. Thomas Hartwell, the owner of one of the biggest ranches in the whole territory, was having his annual gathering. Rich cattlemen from all over had come to his property, drinking whiskey and telling tall tales about their adventures. Thomas was the kind of man who loved attention. He had a thick mustache, wore expensive boots, and always made sure everyone knew how successful he was. His ranch stretched for 5,000 acres, with cattle grazing as far as the eye could see. He'd built everything himself, or at least that's what he told people. On this particular day, Thomas had something special planned. 3 massive horses were kept in a separate corral, away from the regular animals. These weren't just any horses. They were wild mustangs, standing taller than any horse most people had ever seen. The locals had started calling them the giant Apaches because of their size and fierce nature. These horses were legends in their own right. The black one, the biggest of them all, had a wild look in his eyes that made even experienced cowboys nervous. The brown one had a scar across his shoulder from fighting off a mountain lion. The gray one was the fastest. They said he could outrun any ranch horse in the territory. Thomas gathered all his guests around the corral. The horses inside were going crazy, running back and forth, kicking up dust and making loud noises that showed just how angry and wild they were. Their hooves thundered against the ground like drums. "Gentlemen," Thomas shouted over the noise, raising his glass of whiskey high in the air, "I've got a proposition for you all. A real challenge for any man who thinks he's got what it takes." The crowd went quiet, curious about what the boastful rancher was about to say. "I'll give my entire ranch, all 5,000 acres, to any man who can tame these 3 horses," Thomas announced with a big laugh. He was sure nobody could do it. The cattlemen looked at each other and started laughing too. They all knew the story of these horses. 4 professional horse breakers had already tried to tame them. One ended up with a broken leg. Another got kicked so hard he couldn't work for 3 months. The third one got thrown off so violently he gave up working with horses altogether. The 4th one took one look at the black stallion and walked away, saying some animals weren't meant to be tamed. "You're joking, Thomas," one of the ranchers called out. "Those animals are devils. They'll kill whoever tries." "That's what makes it interesting," Thomas replied, grinning from ear to ear. "But I'm serious. Any man who can break all 3 of these horses can have everything I own." The crowd erupted in chatter. Some men were already bragging about their horse riding skills, even though deep down they were too scared to actually try. Others were calculating in their heads whether the risk was worth the reward. "I once broke a wild mustang in 2 hours, one rancher boasted, puffing out his chest. "That's nothing," another one said. "I've handled meaner horses than these." But nobody stepped forward to actually accept the challenge. They all just kept talking and drinking, enjoying the spectacle from a safe distance. At the back of the crowd, away from all the noise and bragging, stood a man who hadn't said a single word. His name was Jack Morrison. He was wearing old, worn-out clothes and a weathered hat that had seen better days. His boots were dusty, and he didn't look like much compared to the wealthy ranchers in their fancy outfits. Jack had come to the gathering with a friend who worked on a neighboring property. He wasn't invited personally, he was just tagging along. While everyone else was laughing and making jokes, Jack was watching the horses carefully. His eyes followed their movements, studying how they ran, how they reacted to the noise of the crowd. He noticed things others didn't see. The way the black horse kept looking toward the mountains in the distance, like he was remembering his freedom. The way the brown one stayed close to the gray one, protecting her. The way all 3 of them flinched whenever someone got too close to the fence. "Come on, someone try it," Thomas shouted, still laughing. "What's the matter? All talk and no action?" A few brave souls stepped forward, more from pride than actual courage. They wanted to look tough in front of everyone else. But when they got close to the corral and saw those massive horses up close, saw the wild look in their eyes and heard the aggressive sounds they made, most of them backed away quickly. One rancher from Texas, a big man with a reputation for being fearless, actually climbed over the fence. He had a thick rope in his hand and confidence in his step. The moment he entered the corral, the black horse charged at him. The man barely made it back over the fence in time, his expensive hat falling off and getting trampled in the dust. Everyone laughed, including Thomas. It was all entertainment to them. They didn't see these animals as living creatures that were scared and angry. They just saw a challenge, a bet, something to make the day more exciting. Jack remained silent, still watching. His face didn't show much emotion, but his mind was working. He'd seen horses like this before, though not in circumstances like these. There was something familiar about the way they moved, the way they communicated with each other without making a sound. As the sun started to get lower in the sky, Thomas called an end to the viewing. "All right, everyone inside for dinner. We'll see if anyone's brave enough to try tomorrow. My offer stands, but I'm not worried. These horses will never be tamed. They're too wild, too mean, too dangerous." The crowd started moving toward the big ranch house where Thomas's workers had prepared a feast. The smell of roasted meat filled the air, and the promise of more whiskey got everyone excited. Jack stayed behind for a moment, walking closer to the corral. The three horses had calmed down a bit now that the crowd was leaving. They stood together on the far side, watching him with suspicious eyes. He didn't try to get closer. He just stood there looking at them, and they looked back at him. For a brief moment, something passed between them. Not understanding, not yet, but recognition maybe. Like they could sense he was different from the other men who had been shouting and laughing at them all day. "You coming, Jack?" his friend called out from near the house. Jack nodded and turned away from the corral, but his mind was already made up. He knew what he was going to do. He just had to wait for the right moment. As he walked toward the ranch house, he didn't join in the loud conversations and laughter. He remained quiet, just like he always did, thinking about those three wild horses and what it would really take to reach them. Thomas had no idea that the solution to his impossible challenge was walking right past him, wearing dusty old clothes and saying nothing at all. Jack Morrison wasn't supposed to be at that ranch gathering at all. His friend Robert, who worked as a ranch hand on a neighboring property, had insisted he come along. Robert knew Jack didn't have much, lived a simple life moving from place to place, and thought a good meal and some company might do him good. But what nobody at that gathering knew, what nobody could have guessed by looking at the quiet man in worn-out clothes, was the life Jack had lived before he ended up in Montana. 15 years ago, Jack had been a completely different person. He'd had a wife and a young daughter. They were traveling west on a stagecoach, dreaming of starting a new life in California. Jack had saved up money working in factories back east, and they were finally going to have their own piece of land, their own future. Then everything changed in a single afternoon. The stagecoach was attacked, not by outlaws looking for money, but by desperate men who took everything and left nothing behind. Jack had fought back, trying to protect his family, but there were too many of them. He got hit in the head and blacked out. When he woke up, he was alone. The stagecoach was destroyed and his family was gone. He'd been left for dead in the middle of nowhere, bleeding and broken, with nothing but sand and rocks around him. Jack should have died there. The sun was brutal and he had no water, no supplies, no strength left. He remembers lying there, staring at the sky, thinking this was the end. He almost wanted it to be. But then they found him. A small group of Apache hunters crossing through the territory spotted him from a distance. They could have easily left him there. White men and native tribes weren't exactly friendly during those times. There was a lot of violence, a lot of mistrust on both sides, but these men didn't leave him. They picked him up, gave him water, and took him back to their camp. For weeks, Jack floated between life and death. The tribe's healer worked on him using plants and methods Jack had never seen before. Slowly, very slowly, he recovered. When Jack finally had the strength to speak, to ask questions, he learned that his family's bodies had been found and given a proper burial by another group of travelers. That news broke something inside him that never quite healed, but it also gave him closure, as painful as it was. Jack had nowhere to go, no reason to continue west, no purpose anymore. The tribe that saved him didn't push him to leave. They let him stay, and as months passed, Jack began learning their ways. Not because he had to, but because he needed something to fill the emptiness inside him. He learned their language, ate their food, and helped with their daily work. But what really changed Jack was learning how they worked with horses. The tribe had some of the finest horses he'd ever seen, and they treated these animals completely differently than any white rancher he'd known. There was no breaking involved. No force, no violence, no battle of wills. Instead, there was patience, understanding, respect. They believed horses were partners, not property. They spent time with young horses, letting them get comfortable, building trust slowly. A horse trained this way would do anything for its rider, not because it was beaten into submission, but because it chose to cooperate. An old man named Natan, one of the best horse handlers in the tribe, took Jack under his wing. Natan didn't speak much English, and Jack's Apache was rough at first, but horses became their common language. Day after day, Natan showed Jack things that seemed impossible. He watched Natan calm a wild stallion just by sitting near it for hours, not moving, barely breathing, just being present. He watched him communicate with horses through the smallest gestures, a slight movement of the hand, a particular way of breathing, sounds that were barely whispers. The horses responded like they understood every word. "White men want to break horses," Natan told Jack one day, speaking slowly so Jack could understand. "But broken things don't work well. Better to bend like willow tree. Willow bends in storm but doesn't break." Jack spent 3 years with that tribe, learning everything Natan would teach him. He learned to read horses like books, to understand what their movements meant, what their sounds were saying, what their eyes were telling him. He learned the old songs they would hum and sing to calm frightened animals. He learned to move slowly, to think patiently, to wait as long as it took. Eventually, Jack knew he needed to move on. The tribe understood. They'd given him a reason to live again, taught him skills he'd carry forever, and treated him like family. When he left, Natan gave him a small leather pouch filled with herbs and told him, "You have patient heart now. That is greatest gift for man who works with horses." After leaving the Apache, Jack spent years moving around the frontier. He stayed with different tribes, learning more techniques. He spent time with the Lakota, who taught him different methods. He worked on ranches here and there, but never stayed long. Most ranch owners wanted horses broken fast and rough, and Jack couldn't bring himself to work that way anymore. He saw too many beautiful animals ruined by harsh treatment. Horses that became mean not because they were born that way, but because they were treated with cruelty. Horses that would never trust humans again because their spirit had been crushed instead of earned. That's why Jack moved from place to place. He'd work for a while, save a bit of money, then move on when he couldn't stand watching horses being mistreated anymore. He lived simple, owned almost nothing, and kept to himself mostly. People thought he was just another drifter, and Jack let them think that. It was easier than explaining. Now, standing at Thomas Hartwell's ranch, watching those 3 massive horses in the corral, Jack recognized something immediately. These weren't mean horses. These weren't dangerous animals that deserved to be called devils. These were terrified creatures that had been handled roughly, probably beaten, definitely not understood. The next morning, the entertainment continued. Thomas had set up chairs and tables outside so his guests could watch the attempts in comfort. Ranch hands brought out drinks and food. It was like a show, and the horses were unwilling performers. One by one, experienced cowboys tried their luck. They came with confidence, with ropes and whips, with techniques they swore would work, and one by one they failed. Not just failed, but failed dramatically. The first man lasted maybe 30 seconds in the corral before the black horse charged him. He climbed out so fast he tore his pants on the fence. The crowd laughed and clapped like it was a circus. The second man tried a different approach. He brought grain to lure the horses close. The brown horse with the scar seemed interested at first, walked toward him slowly. But when the man suddenly threw a rope trying to catch the horse by surprise, all 3 animals went wild. They started running and bucking so violently that the man had to abandon his rope and run for his life. The third attempt was the worst. A rancher from Texas, the same one who had lost his hat the day before, decided he'd show everyone how it was done. He brought a long whip and announced he'd break the gray horse first because she was the smallest. "Sometimes you gotta show them who's boss," he declared loudly, cracking his whip in the air. What happened next was fast and brutal. The moment he cracked that whip inside the corral, all 3 horses went crazy. The gray one, the supposedly easiest target, kicked out so fast the man barely saw it coming. Her hoof caught him in the shoulder, and everyone heard the crack of bone breaking. The man screamed in pain and collapsed. Ranch hands had to rush in, risking their own safety, to drag him out while the horses stomped and raged around them. The local doctor, who happened to be at the gathering, confirmed the man's arm was broken in 2 places. That put an end to the entertainment for the day. Even Thomas, who'd been laughing and enjoying the show, looked a bit shaken. That could have been someone's head instead of an arm. Someone could have died. As people helped the injured man to a wagon to take him into town, Jack walked closer to the corral again. The 3 horses were at the far end, breathing hard, eyes wide with fear and adrenaline. They weren't celebrating their victory. They were terrified, Jack stood there quietly watching them calm down slowly, and that's when he made his decision. He knew what he had to do, even though it would probably change his life in ways he couldn't predict. He waited until evening, when most of the guests were inside the ranch house, drinking and talking about the day's excitement. Then Jack found Thomas on the porch smoking a cigar and looking satisfied with himself. "Mr. Hartwell," Jack said quietly, "I'd like to try with those horses." And that's when everything really began. Thomas Hartwell stood on his porch, cigar smoke curling around his face when Jack approached him that evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple, and most of the guests were inside enjoying dinner and more drinks. Thomas looked at Jack like he was seeing him for the first time, which, in a way, he was. The rancher's eyes traveled from Jack's worn-out hat down to his dusty boots, taking in every detail of this nobody who'd just spoken to him. "You want a what?" Thomas asked, not even trying to hide the disbelief in his voice. "I'd like to try taming those 3 horses," Jack repeated calmly. His voice was steady, not challenging, just stating a fact. Thomas laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made it clear he thought Jack was either crazy or stupid. "Boy, did you not see what happened today? A professional horsebreaker just got his arm snapped like a dry twig. What makes you think you could do any better?" "I just think I might have a different approach," Jack said simply. By now, a few people had noticed the conversation and were gathering around. Word spread fast, and soon there was a small crowd on the porch curious about what was happening. "A different approach?" Thomas repeated, still amused. "And what approach would that be? You got some magic trick? You gonna sing them a lullaby?" Some of the guests chuckled at Thomas's joke. They all looked at Jack the same way, like he was entertainment, not a serious challenger. But there was one person watching who felt differently. Eleanor Hartwell, Thomas's daughter, had been sitting on the far end of the porch with a book. She was 26 years old, educated back east in Boston, and had only recently returned home to help her father run the ranch after her mother passed away 2 years ago. Eleanor had been watching the whole spectacle with growing discomfort. She didn't like seeing animals treated the way those horses had been treated. She didn't like the way the men laughed and made bets while creatures suffered. But she'd learned to keep her opinions quiet around her father and his friends. Now looking at this quiet stranger, Eleanor noticed something different about him. While other men had approached those horses with aggression and pride, trying to prove their dominance, this man seemed calm. His eyes were gentle, not hard. There was no boastfulness in his posture. "All right, Drifter," Thomas said, finishing his cigar and tossing it into the dirt. "I'll let you try. This should be good entertainment. But here's the thing, I'm adding a condition." Jack waited, saying nothing. "You got 3 days," Thomas continued, holding up 3 fingers. 3 days to tame all 3 of those horses. If you succeed, the ranch is yours, just like I promised. But if you fail, you owe me a full year of free labor. You'll work this ranch without pay for 12 months. That's the deal. "Take it or leave it," the crowd murmured. It was a harsh condition, almost cruel. Everyone knew Jack would fail, which meant Thomas was basically getting a free worker for a year. But Thomas was clever about it. He'd made this public bet about giving away his ranch, and people were starting to talk. If nobody could meet his challenge, he'd look like all talk. But if someone tried and failed, he could save face and get free labor out of it. Jack thought about it for a moment. A year of his life working for nothing. But he looked past Thomas toward the corral where those 3 horses were, and he nodded. "I accept." "Wonderful," Thomas said, slapping his hands together. "We got ourselves a show, folks. Starting tomorrow morning, this here cowboy is gonna try his luck. Someone get the doc to stick around. We might need him again." More laughter from the crowd. They were already making bets among themselves about how quickly Jack would fail. Some said he wouldn't last an hour. Others gave him until noon the next day at most. "I have one condition of my own," Jack said quietly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. Thomas raised his eyebrows, surprised. "You're in no position to make demands, friend." "It's a simple request," Jack continued. "I need everyone to stay away from the corral while I work. No watching, no interrupting, no one coming near. Just let me work with the horses alone." Thomas found this hilarious. "You want privacy? What, you embarrassed to fail in front of an audience?" "I just work better without distractions," Jack said. "The horses, too. They've had enough people staring at them and treating them like a show." Eleanor spoke up for the first time. "That seems reasonable, Father." Thomas glanced at his daughter, surprised she'd joined the conversation. He wasn't used to her speaking up in front of his business associates. Fine, fine, he said, waving his hand dismissively. You want to fail in private, that's your choice. But every evening you'll demonstrate progress. Fair? Fair, Jack agreed. The deal was set. Thomas had his ranch foreman draw up a quick written agreement and Jack signed it. The guests went back to their drinking and talking, already convinced they knew how this would end. Most of them would be leaving tomorrow anyway, heading back to their own ranches, but they'd hear about the results soon enough. News traveled fast in the territory. That night, Jack didn't sleep much. He lay on the cot in the small bunkhouse where the temporary workers stayed, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night. In the distance, he could hear the 3 horses moving around in their corral, restless and unhappy. He thought about Natan, the old Apache teacher who'd shown him that patience was more powerful than force. He thought about all the horses he'd worked with over the years, each one teaching him something new. And he thought about what lay ahead. Jack knew 3 days wasn't much time. The methods he'd learned required patience, sometimes weeks or even months, to fully earn a horse's trust. But he also knew these horses were desperate for something different, for someone who understood them. That desperation might make them willing to trust faster, if he did everything right. Early the next morning, before the sun was fully up, Jack was at the corral. He didn't bring any of the usual tools. No ropes, no whips, no saddles. He just brought a bucket of fresh water and some good quality hay he'd asked the ranch hands for the night before. The 3 horses watched him from the far side of the corral. The black stallion, the biggest and most aggressive one everyone called Devil, stood in front of the other 2 like a protector. His ears were back and his eyes were full of warning. Jack didn't try to enter the corral yet. He simply set the water and hay near the entrance, then walked a short distance away and sat down in the dirt. He took off his hat, set it beside him, and just sat there. From the ranch house window, Eleanor watched. She'd woken up early, unable to sleep, thinking about this strange cowboy who'd accepted her father's cruel challenge. She made herself coffee and stood by the window, curious about what would happen. She watched Jack sit there for an hour, not moving, barely seeming to breathe. The horses eventually approached the water and hay, still keeping their distance from him. They drank and ate, but never took their eyes off the human sitting nearby. After another hour, Eleanor couldn't help herself. She made a plate of breakfast, eggs and bread and coffee, and walked it out to where Jack was sitting. "Thought you might be hungry," she said softly, not wanting to startle the horses. Jack looked up at her and smiled slightly. "That's kind of you, miss. Thank you." Eleanor set the plate down beside him. She glanced at the horses who'd moved back to the far side when she approached. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you really think you can do this?" "Everyone's saying it's impossible." Jack was quiet for a moment, watching the 3 horses watch him back. "I don't know if I can do it in 3 days, but I know those horses aren't the problem everyone thinks they are. They're scared and angry because of how they've been treated. If I can show them something different, maybe they'll give me a chance." "You sound like you actually care about them," Eleanor said, and there was surprise in her voice. "Most men just see them as a challenge to beat." "Horses aren't challenges," Jack replied. "They're living beings with feelings and memories. They remember every kindness and every cruelty. Those 3 have been shown nothing but cruelty. They're just protecting themselves the only way they know how." Eleanor found herself sitting down in the dirt next to Jack, something she'd never normally do in her dress. But something about this moment felt different. "Where did you learn to think about horses this way?" And for the first time in years, Jack told someone his story. Not all of it. Not the painful parts about losing his family, but about the years he'd spent learning from tribes across the frontier. About Natan and the old ways of working with horses. About patience and respect and partnership. Eleanor listened, fascinated. She'd been educated in fancy schools, learned literature and mathematics and proper manners. But this was a different kind of wisdom, one that made more sense to her than anything she'd learned in those classrooms. "My father's going to lose his ranch if you succeed," Eleanor said quietly. "You know that, right?" "I know," Jack said. "That's why I won't fail." Eleanor looked at him, trying to understand this man who seemed to have nothing but was willing to risk a year of his life for 3 horses most people had given up on. There was something honorable about him, something genuine that was rare in her experience. She stood up, brushing dirt from her dress. I should go back before Father wonders where I am, but I'll bring you lunch later if that's all right. The first full day passed in a way that would have seemed completely boring to anyone watching. But Jack knew that what looked like nothing was actually everything. He spent the entire morning just sitting outside the corral, exactly as he'd started. The sun climbed higher, the temperature rose, and still Jack sat there like a statue. His body was relaxed, but his attention never wavered. He watched the horses, and they watched him back. Every hour or so he'd hum quietly, not loud enough to be heard from the ranch house, but loud enough for the horses to hear. These were the old songs Natan had taught him, melodies that had been passed down through generations. The songs had no words, just sounds that somehow felt calming, natural, like wind through trees or water over stones. The 3 horses moved around the corral, but they always kept their distance. The black stallion Devil never fully relaxed. He stayed alert, watching Jack's every tiny movement. The brown horse with the scar was less aggressive but more nervous, jumping at small sounds. The gray mare, the one they said was fastest, seemed the most curious. She'd take a few steps toward Jack, then retreat when her fear overcame her curiosity. Around noon, just as Jack had requested, Eleanor brought fresh water in a large bucket. She walked slowly, carefully, not making sudden movements. The horses moved away when she approached, but not as frantically as they had before. Any progress? She asked quietly, setting the bucket down. More than you'd think, Jack replied. See how they're breathing? Slower than yesterday, and the gray one, she's been watching me more than the others. That's interest, not just fear. Eleanor looked at the horses, trying to see what Jack saw. To her, they still looked wild and dangerous, but she trusted that he knew something she didn't. Father's friends all left this morning, she said. They were laughing, saying you'd be working here for free by the end of the week. Father's in a good mood. He thinks he's already won. Jack nodded, but didn't seem bothered by this information. What do you think? Eleanor surprised herself by saying, I think those horses are lucky you're the one in that corral and not one of those other men. She brought him lunch. Simple food, but plenty of it, and then left him to his work. As she walked back to the house, she noticed ranch hands peeking around corners, trying to see what was happening. Word had spread that the stranger was just sitting there doing nothing, and people were confused. This wasn't how you broke horses. Everyone knew you had to show them who was boss, had to dominate them into submission. But Jack wasn't trying to dominate anything. He was trying to communicate. Every time one of the horses looked at him, he'd look back calmly. When they moved, he'd watch but not react with tension. He was showing them, hour by hour, that he was predictable, calm, and not a threat. By late afternoon, something small but significant happened. The gray mare approached the fence where Jack was sitting. She came close enough that if Jack had reached out, he could have touched her nose, but he didn't reach out. He just sat there humming his quiet song and let her choose how close she wanted to be. The mare sniffed the air around him. Horses have an incredible sense of smell, and she was reading everything she could about this strange human who didn't act like other humans. She smelled the leather of his jacket, the soap he'd used that morning, the coffee he'd been drinking. But most importantly, she smelled the absence of fear and aggression. Jack's scent was calm, patient, unthreatening. After a minute, the mare walked away, but Jack knew this was a breakthrough. She'd chosen to investigate him. That meant curiosity was starting to overcome fear. As the sun began to set, Thomas came out to see the promised progress report. He brought 2 ranch hands with him, and they all stood a good distance from the corral as Jack had requested. Well, Thomas called out. Let's see what a day of sitting in the dirt has accomplished. Jack stood up slowly, his muscles stiff from sitting so long. He turned to face Thomas and said simply, They drank the water I brought them. They ate the hay. The gray one approached the fence. Thomas stared at him for a moment, then burst out laughing. That's it? That's your progress? Those horses have to drink and eat anyway. They're not doing you any favors. They didn't have to drink water I brought them, Jack replied calmly. They didn't have to eat hay I placed there. They could have refused, stayed away from anything I touched. But they didn't. That's progress. You got 2 more days, Cowboy, Thomas said, shaking his head. And if this is the pace we're moving at, you better get used to the idea of working here for free. He walked away, still chuckling, his ranch hands following behind him. But Eleanor, who'd been watching from the porch, came down to where Jack was gathering his things. Don't listen to him, she said. I saw what happened with the gray horse. That meant something, didn't it? It meant everything, Jack confirmed. Fear is learned, and so is trust. They're starting to unlearn their fear. Slowly, but it's happening. That night, Jack slept a bit better, though he was up before dawn again. The second day began much like the first, but with a crucial difference. The horses were expecting him now. When he arrived at the corral, they didn't scatter to the far side. They stayed in the middle, watching, waiting to see what he'd do. Jack brought fresh water and hay again, but this time he also brought something else. A leather bag filled with herbs and sweet-smelling plants that Natan had taught him about. He sprinkled some of the dried plants into the hay, knowing the horses would find the scent interesting and the taste pleasant. Then he did something that would have seemed crazy to anyone watching. He opened the corral gate and stepped inside. The black stallion immediately tensed, ears flat against his head, ready to charge. The brown horse moved protectively next to the gray mare. Jack could feel the electricity in the air, the potential for violence. One wrong move and he'd be trampled or kicked. But Jack didn't make any wrong moves. He walked slowly, not toward the horses, but toward the side of the corral. He sat down in the dirt inside the pen about 20 feet from the three animals and began his humming again. The horses watched him with intense focus, trying to understand this strange behavior. Humans who entered the corral always came with ropes and whips, always tried to catch them, always brought pain and struggle. But this human just sat there making his peaceful sounds, not threatening anyone. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Jack sat, the horses watched. Occasionally one of them would move, and Jack would watch their movement but never react with fear or aggression. He was showing them that he respected their space, their choices, their right to be cautious. Around mid-morning, the gray mare did something brave. She walked toward the hay that Jack had brought, the hay with the herbs mixed in. The other two horses stayed back, but she needed to know what that interesting smell was. She approached carefully, one step at a time, ready to bolt if Jack moved wrong. Jack stayed perfectly still. The mare reached the hay and took a bite. Her eyes widened slightly. This hay tasted better than normal hay. She took another bite, then another, and slowly, cautiously, the other two horses approached as well. Within minutes, all three were eating the hay Jack had brought, less than 15 feet from where he sat. This was the moment everything could go wrong. Jack knew he had to solidify this progress without scaring them. Very slowly, so slowly the movement was barely visible, he began to hum a different song. This one was slightly more melodic, with gentle rises and falls in tone. The black stallion's ears twitched forward. That was a good sign. Ears forward meant interest, attention, not aggression. The horse kept eating but was clearly listening to the sound Jack was making. When Eleanor brought lunch, she gasped quietly when she saw Jack was inside the corral with the horses. "Is that safe?" she whispered, standing outside the fence. "It's necessary," Jack replied, not taking his eyes off the three animals. "They need to learn I can share their space without being a threat." "My father would have a fit if he saw this," Eleanor said. "He'd think you were trying to get yourself killed." "Your father doesn't understand horses," Jack said gently. "He thinks they need to be conquered. But partnership is always stronger than conquest." Eleanor set the food down outside the fence, not wanting to disturb the delicate peace inside the corral. As she walked away, she looked back and saw something that made her heart skip. The gray mare had moved slightly closer to Jack, close enough that if both of them stretched, they could touch. The horse was choosing to be near him. By afternoon, Jack made his next move. He began speaking to the horses in a low, steady voice. Not English words, but phrases in Apache, the language Natan had used. The horses didn't understand the words, of course, but they understood the tone. Calm, friendly, reassuring. "You've been treated badly," Jack said softly in Apache. "But not all humans are the same. Some of us understand. Some of us respect what you are." The black stallion, Devil, turned his head to look directly at Jack. For a long moment, their eyes met. Jack didn't look away, didn't show fear. He just looked back with calm acceptance, letting the horse read his intentions through his gaze. And then something remarkable happened. The stallion took one step toward Jack. Just one step, but it was voluntary, curious, not aggressive. The massive horse, the one everyone said was completely untamable, had chosen to move closer to a human instead of away. The third day began with tension in the air. Jack could feel it the moment he woke up. Today was the deadline. Today he either proved he could ride those horses, or he'd be working on this ranch for free for the next 12 months. But Jack had learned long ago not to let pressure change his approach. Rushing with horses only led to mistakes, and mistakes with animals this powerful could be deadly. He arrived at the corral even earlier than usual, while the stars were still visible in the lightening sky. The 3 horses were awake, watching him approach. Over the past 2 days, they'd learned his routine, learned his scent, learned the sound of his footsteps. They knew it was him before they could even see him clearly. Jack entered the corral slowly, bringing water and the special hay mixture they'd come to enjoy. But today he also brought something else. 3 soft leather blankets that he'd borrowed from the tack room, and a rope made of braided horsehair, much softer than the harsh ropes usually used. The horses approached the hay without as much hesitation as before. The gray mare came closest as she'd been doing. The brown horse with the scar was more comfortable now too. Even Devil, the big black stallion, no longer pinned his ears back when Jack was near. Jack sat down and began his morning humming, the songs that had become familiar to the horses. Then he did something new. He stood up slowly and began moving around the corral, not toward the horses but in a wide circle, letting them watch his movements. He was showing them he could walk around their space without threatening them. After about an hour of this slow movement, Jack approached the gray mare. He kept his body language soft, non-threatening, and extended his hand slowly. The mare sniffed his hand, just as she'd done with his jacket on that first day. Then, very gently, Jack touched her nose. It was the first physical contact between them. The mare tensed but didn't pull away. Jack stroked her soft nose once, twice, 3 times, all while humming his calming song. The mare's eyes softened. This touch wasn't painful or scary. It was gentle, kind. That's when things went wrong. Thomas Hartwell had been watching from the ranch house with growing frustration. 2 days had passed, and this cowboy was still just playing around with the horses. Yes, they seemed calmer. But where was the actual horse breaking? Where was the riding? Thomas's friends had been sending messages, asking for updates, probably laughing at him for making a bet he couldn't control. His pride couldn't take it anymore. Around mid-morning, Thomas stormed out of the house with 3 of his ranch hands. They were carrying ropes, a saddle, and determination on their faces. Eleanor saw them from her bedroom window and her heart sank. She ran downstairs calling after her father, but he wasn't listening. He'd made up his mind. Enough of this nonsense, Thomas announced loudly as he approached the corral. It's the final day, and we need to see some real progress. Time to show these animals who's in charge. Jack, who'd been making incredible progress with the mare, turned to face Thomas. Mr. Hartwell, please don't come any closer. We're at a very delicate point right now. Delicate? Thomas laughed harshly. Boy, you've had 2 days to play your little games. Now it's time to actually break these horses. Men, get in there and rope that gray one. We'll show this drifter how it's really done. Please don't do this, Jack said, his voice more urgent now. You'll undo everything. These horses are just starting to trust. But Thomas wasn't interested in trust or patience or any of Jack's methods. He was interested in results, in maintaining his reputation, in proving that his way was the right way. He ordered his men to climb into the corral. The effect was immediate and devastating. The 3 horses, who'd been calm and relaxed just moments before, suddenly panicked. They'd seen men with ropes before. They knew what came next: the violence, the pain, the struggle. All the fear that Jack had spent 2 days helping them overcome came flooding back in an instant. Devil, the black stallion, let out a sound that was almost like a scream. The brown horse reared up on his back legs. The gray mare, who'd just been gently touching Jack's hand, bolted to the far side of the corral. Get that rope on the gray. 1! Thomas shouted to his men, who were now inside the corral with lassos ready. What happened next was chaos. The ranch hands, experienced as they were, approached with confidence and aggressive intent. They swung their ropes, trying to catch the horses around the neck. But these weren't broken horses, and they weren't going to submit easily. The gray mare dodged the first rope. The brown horse charged at one of the men, forcing him to scramble over the fence. Devil was pure rage, all the trust he'd been building thrown away in an instant. Jack tried to intervene, tried to calm the situation, but it was too late. The horses were in full panic mode. One of the ranch hands managed to get a rope around the brown horse's neck, and the animal went wild, bucking and pulling with incredible force. In the midst of all this chaos, Thomas himself decided to show everyone how it was done. He climbed into the corral, grabbed a rope from one of his men, and went straight for Devil, the biggest and most dangerous of the three. "This one first," Thomas declared. "Break the leader, and the others will follow." Thomas swung his rope with practiced skill and actually managed to loop it over Devil's head. For a moment he looked triumphant. He'd caught the uncatchable horse, but his celebration was premature. Devil, feeling the rope tighten around his neck, responded with pure survival instinct. The massive stallion reared up, towering over Thomas, hooves slashing through the air. Then Devil charged, not away from Thomas, but directly at him. Thomas, suddenly realizing his mistake, tried to run, but his boot caught on something, maybe a rock or a clump of dirt, and he went down hard. The rope was still in his hand, still, attached to a very angry horse who was now bearing down on him. Jack didn't think. He just moved. In 2 seconds, he crossed the distance between himself and Thomas, putting his body between the rancher and the charging stallion. Devil's hoof came down, missing Thomas's head by inches, so close that Thomas felt the wind from it and smelled the dust it kicked up. "Devil, stop!" Jack shouted, not in English but in Apache, using the word Natan had taught him. It meant friend or peace or something like that. Jack couldn't remember exactly in the heat of the moment. He just said it with every ounce of authority and calm he could muster. The stallion froze. His hoof was in midair for the next strike. His eyes were wild. His entire body was coiled with rage and fear. But something in Jack's voice, something in that word spoken in a language the horse didn't know but somehow recognized, made him pause. Jack stood there between the horse and the man on the ground, not moving. His heart was pounding, his mind was racing, but his body was perfectly still. He looked directly into Devil's eyes and spoke again, softly this time, in Apache. "I know you're scared. I know you're angry. But this isn't you. You're not a killer. You're scared, and that's okay. I'm here. I see you. You're safe." The stallion's hoof slowly lowered to the ground. His breathing was hard and fast. His muscles were tense, but he wasn't charging anymore. The two of them stood there, man and horse, connected by something deeper than language. Thomas, still on the ground, was breathing hard, his face pale. He'd just seen his life flash before his eyes. That hoof could have crushed his skull. He would have died right there in his own corral, killed by a horse he'd been too proud to understand. Jack very slowly reached up toward the rope around Devil's neck. The horse watched him but didn't move away. With gentle fingers, Jack loosened the rope and slipped it off, freeing the stallion. Then he took a step back, giving the horse space. "Everyone out of the corral," Jack said firmly, not taking his eyes off Devil. Slowly, no sudden moves. For once, Thomas didn't argue. His ranch hands helped him to his feet, and they all walked carefully toward the gate. Eleanor, who'd been watching the whole terrifying scene, had her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. She'd truly thought her father was about to die. Once everyone was out and the gate was closed, the three horses huddled together at the far end of the corral, traumatized, scared, all the progress destroyed. Jack stood outside the fence, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Thomas leaned against the fence, still catching his breath. His expensive shirt was torn and covered in dust. His pride was hurt even worse than his body. He looked at Jack, really looked at him for the first time, and saw something he hadn't seen before. "You saved my life," Thomas said quietly. "That horse was going to kill me, and you stepped in front of it." "He wasn't going to kill you," Jack replied. "He was scared and defensive. There's a difference." "Could have fooled me," Thomas said, trying to laugh but failing. His voice was shaky. "That hoof came close enough." Jack turned to face Thomas directly. "Mr. Hartwell, I need you to understand something. Those horses aren't mean. They're not evil. They're traumatized. Every time someone tries to break them with force, you make it worse. I was so close today. The gray mare let me touch her. Devil was starting to trust me. And then all of this happened, and now they're back to square one." Thomas looked at the 3 horses, now pressed together at the far end of the corral, shaking and afraid. He looked at his torn shirt, felt the pain in his back from hitting the ground, remembered the shadow of that massive hoof about to come down on his head. After the chaos in the corral, the ranch fell into an unusual quiet. The hands went about their work but kept glancing toward where Jack stood alone by the fence. Thomas retreated to his office, still shaken from his near-death experience. And Eleanor found herself unable to stay inside the house. She made fresh coffee and walked out to where Jack was standing, still watching the 3 horses who hadn't moved from their huddle at the far end of the corral. They looked defeated, broken in the worst way possible, not in body but in spirit. "Here," Eleanor said softly, handing Jack a cup of coffee. "You look like you could use it." Jack accepted it gratefully. His hands had finally stopped shaking, but the adrenaline crash had left him exhausted. "Thank you." They stood in silence for a few minutes, both watching the horses. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "What you did back there, stepping between my father and that stallion, that was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen." "Probably both," Jack admitted with a tired smile. "But I couldn't just watch him get hurt. And Devil? That's what everyone calls the black one. He's not a killer. He was just scared out of his mind." "Devil," Eleanor repeated. "That's an awful name for an animal." "It is," Jack agreed. "Names matter. When you call something a devil, you treat it like a devil. When you call it something else, something gentler, you treat it differently." Eleanor considered this. "What would you call him?" Jack thought about it, watching the magnificent black stallion who was still breathing hard, still tense. "Shadow, maybe. He's dark and powerful, but shadows aren't evil. They're just part of the light." Eleanor found herself smiling despite the terrible situation. Shadow is much better than Devil. She paused, then asked the question that had been on her mind. "Can you really still do this? You have maybe 6 or 7 hours until sunset." "Honestly, I don't know," Jack said. "It took me 2 days to get them to trust me enough for the gray mare to let me touch her nose. Now all that trust is gone. They're more scared than when I started." They fell into silence again. Eleanor wanted to say something comforting, something hopeful, but she didn't know what. Instead, she found herself saying, "Tell me more about where you learned all this. About the people who taught you." Jack glanced at her, surprised by the request. But there was genuine interest in her eyes, not just polite conversation. So he told her about the stagecoach attack he'd never mentioned before, about losing his family, about wanting to die in that desert, about the Apache hunters who saved him instead of leaving him there. Eleanor listened with growing emotion. She'd lost her mother 2 years ago and knew the pain of loss, but she couldn't imagine losing everyone all at once like Jack had. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I can't even imagine." "It was a long time ago," Jack said, though his voice suggested the wound wasn't entirely healed. "But it changed everything about who I was. The man I am now, the way I see the world, the way I work with horses, all of that came from that terrible day and what followed." He told her about Natan, the old horse handler who'd taken him under his wing, about learning that horses weren't property to be dominated but partners to be earned, about spending 3 years learning patience in a world that valued speed and force. Natan used to say that white men want to break horses, but broken things don't work as well as whole things, Jack explained. He said you should bend like willow, not break like dry wood. The same applies to horses. If you break their spirit, you get an obedient animal maybe, but you lose their heart. If you earn their partnership, you get something much more valuable. Eleanor found this philosophy fascinating. Her education back east had taught her about literature and music and proper social behavior, but nothing about this kind of wisdom. "Is that why you move from place to place? Because most ranchers don't work this way?" Jack nodded. "Most places I've worked, the owners want results fast. They don't have patience for spending weeks or months with a horse. They want it broken in days, and they don't care much about the cost to the animal. After a while, I couldn't watch it anymore, so I'd move on." "That must be lonely," Eleanor observed, "never staying anywhere long enough to call it home." "It is," Jack admitted, "but I told myself it was better than compromising what I believe in." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised both of them. "What if you didn't have to compromise? What if you found a place that valued your methods, that wanted to work with horses the way you do?" Before Jack could respond, Eleanor continued, her words coming faster now, like she'd been holding them in and finally found the courage to say them out loud. "My father, he's a proud man. Too proud sometimes. But he's also drowning, Jack. He's drowning and trying to hide it. Jack looked at her, confused. What do you mean? Eleanor took a deep breath. The ranch, everything you see here, it's not as solid as it looks. Father has gambling debts, serious ones. He made bad investments, got involved with the wrong people, and now he owes money he doesn't have. That's why he made this impossible bet about the horses. He was hoping nobody could actually tame them, but the bet would make him look confident and powerful. It would maintain the illusion that everything is fine. Jack absorbed this information. Suddenly a lot of things made more sense. Thomas's over-the-top confidence, the way he'd been so certain nobody could succeed. His anger when Jack had started making actual progress. If you succeed today, Eleanor continued, my father loses everything his family built over 3 generations. This ranch has been in our family for almost 60 years. His father started it with nothing, and father expanded it into what it is now. Or what it was, she corrected sadly. The debts have been eating away at it for 2 years now. Why are you telling me this? Jack asked gently. Because you deserve to know what's really at stake, Eleanor said. And because I'm torn. Part of me wants you to succeed because I believe in what you're doing, and those horses deserve someone who understands them. But part of me is terrified of what will happen to my father if he loses everything. Jack looked back at the 3 horses, still clustered together, still scared. Then he looked at the ranch house where Thomas was probably sitting in his office, dealing with the reality of his situation. Then he looked at Eleanor, this educated, thoughtful woman who'd shown him nothing but kindness since he arrived. Your father almost died today, Jack said quietly, not because those horses are evil, but because he refused to listen, refused to see that there might be a different way. If I walk away now, if I fail and spend a year working here, what do you think happens to those 3 horses? Eleanor knew the answer. Father will sell them, probably to someone who'll use them for hard labor until they break down completely, or worse. Exactly, Jack said. So I can't walk away. Not for the ranch, not for the bet, but for them. They deserve better. Eleanor felt tears welling up in her eyes. You're a good man, Jack Morrison. Better than most I've met. They stood together in companionable silence for a few more minutes. Then Eleanor asked, what will you do if you succeed? Will you really take the ranch from my father? Jack had been thinking about this exact question since Thomas had made the bet. I don't know, he admitted. I never wanted a ranch. I just wanted to help those horses. The rest of it, the property and the cattle and all of that, I don't know what I'd do with it. You could run it, Eleanor said, the idea forming as she spoke. You could run it your way, using your methods. Imagine a ranch where horses are trained with patience and respect instead of force. Word would spread. People would come from all over to buy horses trained by you. It was a beautiful vision, and for a moment Jack let himself imagine it. A place where he could finally put down roots, where he could teach others his methods, where horses wouldn't have to suffer. But it also meant taking everything from a family that had built this place over generations. First things first, Jack said, setting down his coffee cup. I need to see if I can fix what got broken this morning. I've got about 6 hours. If I can't do it, none of this matters anyway. Eleanor watched as Jack took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked slowly toward the corral gate. The 3 horses watched his approach with tension in every line of their bodies. Jack? Eleanor called out. He turned back. Whatever happens, thank you. Thank you for trying. Thank you for showing us there's a different way. And thank you for saving my father's life. Even though he probably didn't deserve it. Jack tipped his hat to her. A small gesture that somehow felt significant, and then turned back to face the biggest challenge of his life. The sun was past its peak now, beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. Time was running out. As Eleanor walked back to the house, she found her father standing on the porch watching. His face was drawn, tired, older than she'd ever seen it. He's a remarkable young man, Thomas said quietly, different from anyone I've known. He is, Eleanor agreed. I've been a fool, Thomas admitted, something Eleanor had never heard him say before. About the horses, about the bet, about a lot of things. Eleanor took her father's hand. We all make mistakes, Father. The question is what we do after we realize we've made them. Together they watched Jack enter the corral once more, and 3 frightened horses who had every reason never to trust a human again. Jack stood inside the corral, and the 3 horses stood as far from him as they could get. It was like starting completely over, except worse, because now they didn't just fear humans in general. They specifically remembered what had just happened. The ropes, the shouting, the chaos. All the worst parts of their experience brought back to the surface. The son told Jack he had maybe 6 hours until sunset. 6 hours to accomplish what should take weeks. 6 hours to rebuild trust that had been shattered in minutes. He sat down in the dirt, right in the middle of the corral, and began to hum. The same songs as before, the melodies Natan had taught him so many years ago. His voice was steady, even though his heart was pounding. He was scared, not for himself, but for what would happen if he failed. Those horses deserved better than what they'd get if he couldn't reach them. The 3 horses watched him but didn't move. Their ears flicked back and forth, listening to his humming but remaining suspicious. They'd heard gentle sounds before, and then men with ropes had come. Why should they trust any of it? An hour passed. Jack just sat and hummed. His legs were cramping, his back hurt, but he didn't move. Moving would break the spell, break the fragile connection he was trying to rebuild. Word had spread across neighboring ranches that today was the deadline. Despite Thomas's orders for privacy, people started gathering outside the property. Not close enough to disturb anything, but close enough to watch. They climbed on fence posts and stood on wagons trying to see what was happening. The story of the impossible bet had become legend, and everyone wanted to see how it ended. Inside the ranch house, Thomas paced in his office. Eleanor sat by the window watching Jack in the corral. The ranch hands tried to work, but they kept glancing over, curious and worried. After 2 hours, something small happened. The gray mare, the one who'd been making the most progress before everything went wrong, took a single step toward Jack. Just one step, but it meant everything. It meant she remembered somewhere beneath her fear that this human had been different, that his touch had been gentle, not painful. Jack acknowledged her movement with the smallest nod, but didn't otherwise react. He kept humming, kept being present, kept showing her through his stillness that he was safe. Another hour passed. The sun was moving steadily across the sky, and Jack was running out of time. But rushing would guarantee failure, so he forced himself to remain patient. Everything Natan had taught him came down to this moment. Trust couldn't be forced, only earned. The brown horse with the scar moved next. He'd been the most nervous of the 3, the one who jumped at sudden sounds. But he took 2 steps toward Jack, then stopped, then took 2 more. He was testing, trying to figure out if the peaceful human from before was still there, or if that had been an illusion. Jack spoke to them softly in Apache, words they couldn't understand, but tone they could feel. I know you're scared. I know what happened was terrifying. But I'm still here. I'm still the same. I haven't changed. I'm still the one who brought you good hay and fresh water. I'm still the one who sat with you without demanding anything. Please remember. Please try to remember. Shadow, the big black stallion everyone had called Devil, was the last to move. He'd been the most aggressive, the most protective of the other 2. He'd almost killed Thomas just hours ago. Now he stood there, powerful and uncertain, trying to decide if this human was worth the risk. 4 hours gone. 2 hours left. The crowd outside had grown larger. Someone had even brought chairs and was selling food like it was a fair. Thomas came out to the porch, unable to stay inside any longer. Eleanor joined him, and they stood together watching. He's not going to make it, Thomas said quietly. There's not enough time. Maybe, Eleanor replied. But look at them. They're closer to him than they were an hour ago. They're remembering. And they were. Slowly, carefully, the 3 horses were approaching Jack. The gray mare was closest now, maybe 8 feet away. The brown horse was right behind her. Shadow remained back, but his ears were forward, pointed at Jack, listening to every sound. Jack decided it was time to try something. Very slowly, moving like he was underwater, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch Natan had given him so many years ago. Inside were dried herbs, sweet-smelling plants that horses loved. He'd been saving them, using them sparingly, but now seemed like the right time. He pulled out a few of the dried leaves and held them in his open palm, extending his arm just slightly, offering. The scent drifted toward the horses on the light breeze, and Jack saw the gray mare's nostrils flare as she caught the smell. She knew that smell. She'd had it mixed in her hay for the past 2 days. It was connected to good things, to kindness, to the human who'd been gentle. She took another step forward, then another. Now she was just 5 feet away. Jack remained perfectly still, his hand extended, his breathing slow and even. The mare stretched her neck out, reaching toward his palm, trying to smell the herbs more clearly. She was so close now. One more step and she could touch him. The crowd outside held its collective breath. Thomas gripped the porch railing so hard his knuckles turned white. Eleanor clasped her hands together, silently praying. The gray mare took that final step. Her soft nose touched Jack's palm, and she lipped at the herbs gently, taking them into her mouth. The taste was good, familiar. Jack didn't move except to slowly stroke her nose with his other hand, the same gentle touch he'd given her that morning before everything went wrong. "That's good," Jack whispered. "That's so good. You remember. You're so brave." The brown horse, seeing his companion wasn't being hurt, approached as well. He was more nervous, more skittish, but the smell of those herbs was too tempting. Within minutes, both horses were eating from Jack's hands, letting him touch their faces, starting to relax. But Shadow still held back. The big stallion watched everything with intense focus. He wanted to trust. Jack could see it in his eyes, but he'd been hurt too many times before. He was the leader, the protector, and accepting this human meant putting his whole herd at risk. Jack knew he needed Shadow most of all. The gray mare and the brown horse would follow the stallion's lead. If Shadow accepted him, truly accepted him, the others would feel safe. But if Shadow refused, the other two would remain uncertain. 1 hour until sunset. The light was turning golden, casting long shadows across the corral. Jack made a decision. He stood up slowly and both horses near him tensed but didn't run. That was progress. He walked to the edge of the corral where he'd left the soft leather blankets earlier that morning, before the chaos had started. He picked up one blanket and walked back to the center of the corral. The gray mare and brown horse watched but stayed relatively calm. Shadow, however, took several steps back. He remembered what came after blankets. Saddles, cinches pulled tight, pain and struggle. Jack sat down again with the blanket in his lap. He wasn't going to force anything. Instead, he let the horses come to him. The gray mare approached first, curious about the blanket. Jack let her sniff it, even let her mouth it gently. It was just leather, soft and harmless. Then, moving so slowly that each motion took several seconds, Jack draped the blanket across his own shoulders. He was showing the horses that this thing wasn't dangerous. He wore it like a shawl, sitting peacefully, humming his songs. The brown horse stepped closer, intrigued. He sniffed at the blanket on Jack's shoulders, and Jack remained still. After a minute, Jack carefully removed the blanket and, with the gray mare standing right next to him, gently laid it across her back. The mare stiffened, but didn't bolt. Jack kept his hand on the blanket on her back, just resting there. No weight, no pressure, just presence. The mare stood there, breathing fast, deciding whether to panic or trust. She chose trust. Jack removed the blanket after just a few seconds. He didn't want to push too hard. He let her know that the blanket came off just as easily as it went on. Nothing was permanent, nothing was a trap. He repeated this with the brown horse, who was more nervous but followed the mare's lead. On and off the blanket went, each time staying a little longer until both horses were comfortable with the feeling of something on their backs. 30 minutes until sunset. The sky was turning pink and orange. Thomas looked at his pocket watch, then at Eleanor. Even if he gets the blankets on them, he needs to ride them. That was the challenge. He needs to actually ride all three. He knows that, Father, Eleanor said quietly. Jack knew time was running out. He picked up the second blanket and walked slowly toward Shadow. The big stallion's entire body tensed, ready to run or fight. But Jack didn't approach directly. Instead, he walked past Shadow, not looking at him, not challenging him, just moving to a different part of the corral. This confused Shadow. Usually humans came right at him, tried to corner him, tried to force. But this human was leaving him alone. Jack sat down again about 10 feet from Shadow and draped the second blanket over his own shoulders again, showing the same thing he'd shown the other horses. Then Jack did something that took enormous courage. He lay down on his back in the dirt, the blanket still on his shoulders, and closed his eyes. He made himself completely vulnerable to a horse that had nearly killed a man just hours ago. It was the ultimate display of trust. That evening, the ranch house was filled with a strange mixture of celebration and tension. The crowd that had gathered outside slowly dispersed, people heading home with an incredible story to tell. They'd witnessed something that most folks said was impossible. A quiet cowboy had tamed 3 wild horses using nothing but patience and understanding. Inside Thomas's office, legal documents were spread across the desk. The rancher's lawyer had been summoned immediately, and he'd arrived with the papers that would transfer ownership of the entire 5,000-acre property to Jack Morrison. Everything was official, witnessed by multiple people. The bet had been clear and Jack had won. Thomas sat behind his desk staring at the papers that needed his signature. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from the near-death experience earlier or the reality of losing everything, nobody could tell. Eleanor stood by the window. Her emotions tangled between admiration for what Jack had accomplished and fear for what would happen to her father. Jack stood across from Thomas, still dusty from the corral, still tired from the most intense 3 days of his life. The room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "I should have listened to you," Thomas finally said, his voice quiet and broken. "About the horses, about the methods. I've spent my whole life thinking I knew the right way to do things. And today I learned I've been wrong about a lot." "Mr. Hartwell," Jack began, but Thomas held up his hand. "Let me finish," the rancher said. "This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather started with nothing but determination and built something from dust and dreams. My father expanded it, made it prosperous. I was supposed to protect it, grow it, pass it on to my children." He glanced at Eleanor. "Instead, I gambled it away on my own arrogance." Thomas picked up the pen and held it over the papers. "A deal is a deal. I'm a man of my word, even when my word cost me everything." This was the moment Jack had been thinking about since Eleanor had told him the truth about the ranch's situation. He'd had hours in that corral, sitting with those horses to think about what he really wanted, what mattered, what kind of man he wanted to be. "Mr. Hartwell," Jack said firmly. "Put the pen down." Thomas looked up confused. "What?" "Put the pen down," Jack repeated. "I don't want your ranch." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor turned from the window, her eyes wide. The lawyer looked between both men, uncertain what was happening. "You don't want it?" Thomas repeated like he'd heard wrong. "But you won. Fair and square. The ranch is yours." "I never wanted a ranch," Jack explained. "I wanted to help those 3 horses. That's what mattered to me. They were suffering, being treated wrong, and I knew I could help them. The rest of it, the property and the cattle and the buildings, none of that was why I accepted your challenge." Thomas sat back in his chair, stunned. "Then why did you do it? Why risk a year of free labor? Why go through all that?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Jack said simply. "Those horses deserved better, and honestly, after what Eleanor told me about your situation, taking this ranch wouldn't solve anything. It would just destroy your family's legacy and leave me with something I don't know how to run." Eleanor felt tears forming in her eyes again. This man kept surprising her with his honor and his heart. "But I do want something," Jack continued. "If you're willing to consider it." "Anything," Thomas said quickly. "Name it," Jack took a deep breath. "I want to stay on as your head horse trainer. You pay me a fair wage, nothing fancy, just enough to live on. And you give me a small parcel of land on the edge of your property where I can build a cabin. Something simple, just a place to call home." He paused, then continued. "But there are conditions. I train all the horses on this ranch using my methods. No more breaking by force, no more rough treatment. We do things the right way with patience and respect. It'll take longer, but the horses will be better for it and word will spread. People will come from all over to buy horses trained by us, horses they can trust and rely on." Thomas was processing this, hardly believing what he was hearing. "You'd give up owning all of this just to train horses your way?" "It's not about ownership," Jack said. "It's about doing something meaningful, building something that matters. And honestly, Mr. Hartwell, you almost died today because you didn't understand horses. Imagine what this ranch could become if you learned to see animals the way they deserve to be seen. Not as property to be conquered, but as partners to be respected." The lawyer, who'd been silent this whole time, cleared his throat. "This is highly unusual." The legal agreement was clear. "Then tear it up," Jack said. "I'm not interested in legal agreements that hurt good people. I'm interested in making a life that means something." Thomas stood up from his desk and walked around to face Jack directly. For a long moment, he just looked at this dusty cowboy who'd saved his life, tamed his impossible horses, and was now refusing to take everything he'd won. Then Thomas did something nobody expected. He extended his hand for a handshake and said, "Partner?" Jack looked at the offered hand, saw the genuine gratitude and respect in Thomas's eyes and shook it firmly. "Partner." Eleanor couldn't hold back anymore. She walked over and hugged Jack suddenly, catching him by surprise. "Thank you," she whispered. Thank you for seeing past the easy choice to the right choice. Jack felt his face flush with embarrassment, but also with warmth. Your father's a good man who made some mistakes. We all deserve a chance to learn and do better. The lawyer packed up his papers, shaking his head in amazement. In 20 years of legal work, I've never seen anyone turn down 5,000 acres. You're either the wisest man I've ever met or the craziest. Maybe both, Jack said with a small smile. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Thomas gathered his ranch hands and introduced Jack as the new head horse trainer. Some of the older cowboys were skeptical at first. They'd spent years breaking horses the traditional way. But Thomas was firm. This is how we're doing things now. Anyone who has a problem with that can find work elsewhere. But I'm asking you to trust me and to trust Jack. Give his methods a chance. Most of the hands stayed curious despite their doubts. They'd heard about what happened with the 3 wild horses, and they wanted to see if it was really true or just luck. Jack started teaching them immediately. He showed them how to read a horse's body language, how to approach with calm energy, how to build trust instead of forcing obedience. It was slow at first. Old habits are hard to break. But gradually the ranch hands started to see results. Horses that would have taken weeks of violent struggle to break were now being trained in that same time with gentle methods. And these horses were different. They were confident, willing, eager to work with their handlers. Word did spread just as Jack had predicted. Other ranchers started visiting, curious about this new way of training horses. Some laughed and dismissed it as nonsense, but others watched demonstrations and saw something that impressed them. Within 2 months, the ranch had orders for trained horses from buyers 3 territories away. Thomas's financial situation slowly improved. The gambling debts were still there, but the increased revenue from selling well-trained horses helped him start paying them down. More importantly, Thomas himself changed. He started spending time with Jack, learning the methods, understanding horses in a way he never had before. The pride and arrogance that had nearly cost him everything softened into something better. Wisdom earned through hard lessons. Eleanor found herself spending more time around the corrals too. She'd always loved horses but had been taught to fear them, to see them as dangerous animals that needed to be controlled. Now she was learning to see them differently. Jack taught her how to approach them, how to communicate, how to be present with them. She discovered she had a natural talent for it, a gentle patience that horses responded to beautifully. One evening, about 3 months after that fateful challenge, Eleanor found Jack working on the small cabin that was being built on his parcel of land. The ranch hands had helped him with the foundation and frame, but Jack was doing much of the finish work himself. It's coming along nicely, Eleanor said, climbing the porch steps of the half-finished cabin. It's going to be home, Jack replied, setting down his hammer. First real home I've had in 15 years. They sat together on the porch steps, looking out at the ranch spread before them. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold and orange. In the distance, they could see the corral where Shadow, the gray mare, and the brown horse were grazing peacefully. They were the stars of the ranch now, living proof that horses didn't need to be broken to be wonderful. I never thought I'd see my father change the way he has, Eleanor said. He's like a different person. More humble, more thoughtful. It's like almost dying woke him up to things he'd been blind to. Sometimes it takes almost losing everything to realize what really matters, Jack observed. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said something she'd been thinking about for weeks but hadn't had the courage to say. When you first came here, I thought you were just another drifter passing through, someone who'd try and fail and move on like all the others. I never imagined you'd stay, or that you'd change everything about how this ranch works. Life has a way of surprising us, Jack said.